Yes, at this time, the prosecution would like to call Pat Sikorsky to the stand.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Christopher Brent for the prosecution. May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
Good morning, Dr. Sikorsky.
Good morning.
Please state your name to the court, spelling your last for the record.
My name is Dr. Pat Sikorsky. That's Sikorsky.
Dr. Sikorsky, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm the director of the Criminalistics Laboratory at the Midlands Department of Criminal Investigations.
What education do you have that allows you to hold this position?
I went to school for a very long time, so I have a dual PhD in biology and chemistry from Washington University in St. Louis. I have bachelor's degrees in chemistry and leadership from Marshall University, and I'm an adjunct professor at Midland State University where I teach courses on DNA analysis.
What experience do you have as a criminalist?
Well, before my promotion to being the director of criminalistics, I was a criminalist for 10 years.
Outside of your current occupations, what have you accomplished in your field of expertise?
I've actually accomplished many things. I've published 28 peer-reviewed articles that relate to DNA testing, chemical comparison, collecting trace evidence, things of that nature.
Dr. Sikorsky, please tell the court how you're involved in today's case.
I was called by the prosecution to testify about my findings on a briefcase.
For your work in today's case, were you supplied with sufficient facts and data?
Yes, I was.
Did you use reliable principles and methods?
Yes.
What were those principles and methods?
I used a process called ACE-V to test fingerprints I found on the briefcase. I used mitochondrial DNA testing to identify the hair strands that were found inside the briefcase. I used GCMS to determine what the fragrance stain inside the briefcase was, and I also found skin cells on the left latch of the briefcase.
Did you apply those principles and methods reliably to the facts and data of today's case?
Yes.
What were your findings in your analysis of the briefcase?
I found 4 different types of physical evidence. I found fingerprints on the outside of the briefcase, skin cells on the left latch, hair strands inside the briefcase, and fragrance stain inside the briefcase.
Now, you just mentioned that you ran a couple tests on this briefcase. I'd like to take each test one at a time. Let's talk about the ACE-V test. What is that?
ACE-V is actually an acronym. It stands for Analysis, Comparison, Evaluation, and Verification. It's passed peer review dozens of times, and it's primarily used for fingerprint analysis.
Now, this test has 4 stages. Let's break each of them apart.
Okay.
Let's start with the analysis stage. Please explain to the jury exactly what that is.
Well, the analysis stage is where we look at the fingerprint we have found, and we analyze it to determine if it's of suitable quality for further testing. I found 6 fingerprints on the briefcase, and I discovered after the analysis stage that all were of suitable quality.
Now, please explain the comparison stage.
The comparison stage is where we would take the fingerprint we found and compare it to suspects or databases like the IAFIS, which is the FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. We do this simply to include or exclude suspects from the process.
Go on to explain the evaluation stage.
The evaluation stage is where we look at the little ridges and furrows on human fingers, so the little bumps on your fingers. If they compare to another fingerprint in an area, it's considered a point, and you need 16 points of comparison for a sufficient match.
Finally, please explain the evaluation stage of the process. The verification stage of the process.
The verification stage is where a third-party analyst comes in and tests, in a sense, kind of double checks the primary examiner's work. In today's case, when I was the primary examiner, the third-party analyst came to all of the same conclusions as me.
Dr. Sikorsky, if I had this briefcase that you analyzed in court here to show to you today, would you be able to recognize it?
Yes.
Permission to approach opposing counsel in the witness in turn.
You may.
Dr. Sikorsky, what is that I just handed you?
This looks to be the briefcase I analyzed.
Does it appear to be changed or altered in any way?
No.
Your Honor, at this time, prosecution moves to admit prosecution 1 into evidence.
Defense has no objections, Your Honor.
This will be another.
Dr. Sikorsky, may you please show the jury where you found fingerprints on that briefcase?
Yes. So I found 2 fingerprints on each side of the briefcase right about here. I also found a fingerprint right on the latch, and then I found 3 fingerprints on the handle underneath.
After using your ACE-V analysis, what were your findings of those fingerprints on the briefcase?
Well, at 19 points of comparison, the 2 fingerprints I talked about that were on the sides were consistent with Avery Bancroft's right and left index fingers. The fingerprint at 16 points of comparison that was on the latch right here was consistent with Avery Bancroft's right hand, right thumb. One of the fingerprints underneath of the handle was consistent at 16 points of comparison with Avery Bancroft's right index finger, and the final 2 that were on the handle were consistent with Chase Covington's at 16 points of comparison. It was her right middle and ring finger.
Dr. Sikorsky, let's move on from your fingerprint analysis. Now, you also mentioned that you found strands of hair inside the briefcase. How many strands of hair did you find?
I actually found 5 strands of hair throughout the inside of this briefcase.
How did you test those strands of hair?
I used mitochondrial DNA testing, which is essentially where we take the mitochondria out of the hair and look at the mitochondrial DNA sequence of that mitochondria and compare it to other mitochondria from other parties.
Did you compare the mitochondrial DNA of anyone to those hairs that you found?
Yes, I compared that mitochondrial DNA sequence to the mitochondrial DNA sequence of Chase Covington, Avery Bancroft, and Tracy Manitos, who is Chase Covington's stepsister.
From using mitochondrial DNA to analyze those hairs, what were your findings?
I found that hair was consistent with Chase Covington's, Avery Bancroft's DNA sequence.
Now let's also move on from those hairs. You also mentioned that you found a DNA profile on the left latch of the briefcase. Please explain to the jury how you analyzed that.
Well, I found it right here, and a DNA profile is essentially just skin cells left after you touch something. What I did is I found the DNA from those skin cells and compared it to CODIS, which is a nationwide database. So anytime that you would have gone to the hospital, been arrested, when you become a lawyer, they take your DNA. It would be in the system.
From your analysis, whose DNA profile did you determine that DNA profile found on the briefcase to be?
I determined that DNA to be Avery Bancroft's.
And what is the probability that that DNA profile could belong to someone else?
Wow. The probability of somebody else having the exact same DNA as anyone on the planet is 1 out of 22 billion people.
Now let's also move on from that DNA profile. You mentioned a fragrance stain that you found on the inside fabric of the briefcase. Please explain to the jury what you found.
I found a 1-inch in diameter stain right about here.
What did you do with that stain?
I took a very small cutting of it for further analysis.
How did you analyze that stain?
I analyzed that stain by using gas chromatography mass spectrometry, or GCMS testing, which is easier to pronounce. It's essentially where you take a sample of the substance we found and put it in a temperature-controlled capillary column. It then heats it up and separates it into individual components that you can then identify to other substances.
From your analysis, what did you determine that stain to be?
I determined that stain to be La Nuit de Warhay, which is some French fragrance that was found in Avery Bancroft's home.
Dr. Sikorsky, did you come to any conclusions in your analysis of that briefcase?
Yes, I did. I came to the conclusion that Avery Bancroft came in contact with this briefcase that was in the possession of Chase Covington. But I can't tell you when Avery Bancroft came into contact with this briefcase.
Thank you, Dr. Sikorsky. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness. May I tender evidence to the bench?
Yes, you may.